Chapter 1. Lost in the Aisles. I never imagined that a trip to the grocery store could change my life forever. It was supposed to be a simple errand: milk, bread, some snacks for my son, Ethan. But that day, everything went wrong. We had just moved to Millfield, a small town in Massachusetts. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. After years of city life, it felt like a fresh start for me and Ethan. The grocery store was an old building, the kind that still used handwritten signs and creaky shopping carts. It had a charm to it, a nostalgic feel that reminded me of simpler times. Ethan loved coming here, especially because the store always had a basket of free lollipops near the entrance. "Mom, can I get one?" Ethan asked, his brown eyes wide with excitement. I smiled. "Of course, sweetie. Just stay where I can see you." He grabbed a lollipop, his little hands clutching the bright red wrapper. I turned my attention to the shopping list, mentally ticking off items as I made my way down the aisles. Ethan followed close behind, humming to himself and occasionally darting ahead to look at the cereal boxes. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. I reached for a loaf of bread, and when I turned around, Ethan was gone. At first, I wasn't worried. Kids wander off. I called his name, my voice calm but firm. "Ethan?" No response. I walked down the aisle, expecting to find him around the corner, staring at the candy display or playing with the toy cars. But he wasn't there. My heart started to race. "Ethan?" I called again, louder this time. The store seemed suddenly quieter, the hum of the fluorescent lights growing louder in my ears. I walked faster, checking every aisle, my pulse quickening with each step. He wasn't anywhere. Panic set in. I ran to the front of the store, scanning the checkout lanes and the entrance. The cashier, a teenage boy with a bored expression, glanced at me. "Did you see my son?" I asked, my voice trembling. "He's 6 years old, brown hair, wearing a blue jacket." The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am. I didn't see any kids leave." I rushed back into the aisles, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Maybe he'd gone to the bathroom. Maybe he was hiding, playing a game. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I searched, a strange sensation washed over me, like I was being watched. I glanced around, but the aisles were empty. The store seemed darker than before, the shadows stretching longer. Then I heard it. A soft giggle. "Ethan?" The giggle echoed through the aisles, distant yet clear. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The air felt colder, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly. "Ethan, this isn't funny," I said, my voice wavering. The giggle came again, closer this time. I turned a corner and froze. There he was, standing at the end of the aisle, holding a balloon. It was bright red, the string wrapped around his small hand. But something was off. His eyes, they weren't Ethan's eyes. They were darker, almost black, and they stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Ethan?" I whispered. He tilted his head, the balloon bobbing in the air. "Found you, Mommy," he said, his voice colder than I remembered. I took a step toward him, but he backed away, disappearing around the corner. "Wait." I ran after him, my heart pounding. But when I turned the corner, he was gone. The giggle echoed again, sending chills down my spine. I searched frantically, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Then the lights flickered again, plunging the store into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A row of mannequins stood in the middle of the aisle, their blank faces staring straight ahead. They hadn't been there before, and one of them was holding a red balloon. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The mannequins were motionless, but their presence felt wrong, unnatural. I turned and ran toward the front of the store, desperate to find someone, anyone. But the store was empty. The cashier was gone. The customers were gone. Even the faint hum of the lights had faded into silence. I was alone. Or so I thought. "Mommy?" The voice came from behind me, soft and familiar. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan stood there, his balloon floating beside him. His eyes were normal again, wide and innocent. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I was looking everywhere for you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was here the whole time," he said. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls. And in those shadows, I saw them. Figures. Watching. Waiting. And they all held red balloons. Chapter 2. The Whispering Shadows. Ethan seemed different after we left the store. He was quieter than usual, his bright, chatty demeanor replaced by an unsettling calm. He clutched the red balloon tightly, never letting it drift too far from his side. I tried to brush off my unease, telling myself he was just tired. It had been a long day, after all. But something wasn't right. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, I sat in the living room, replaying the events in my mind. The giggles, the mannequins, the shadows. I had to be imagining things. Maybe it was stress from the move, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I glanced at the clock. 11:58 p.m. The house was quiet, except for the soft creak of the wooden floorboards. I stood up to check on Ethan, my footsteps echoing down the hallway. As I reached his room, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out into the hallway. "Ethan?" I whispered, pushing the door open. He was sitting up in bed, the balloon floating beside him. His eyes were wide, staring at the window. "Sweetheart, what are you doing awake?" I asked, stepping inside. He didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the window. I followed his line of sight, but saw nothing unusual, just the dark silhouette of the tree outside, its branches swaying gently in the wind. "Ethan?" I repeated, my voice trembling slightly. Finally, he turned to look at me. His eyes seemed darker, almost hollow. "They're watching," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's watching?" "The people with balloons." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart. There's no one outside." Ethan didn't respond. He lay back down, clutching the balloon like a lifeline. I pulled the covers up to his chin and kissed his forehead, trying to ignore the knot of dread forming in my stomach. The next morning, Ethan seemed back to normal. He chatted about cartoons during breakfast and asked if we could go to the park later. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that the events of the previous night were just a bad dream. But the unease lingered. As I cleaned up the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The red balloon was still floating near the ceiling, but the string wasn't tied to anything. It drifted aimlessly, moving with an unsettling grace, as if it had a mind of its own. I reached up to grab it, intending to tie it to a chair, but as soon as my fingers brushed the string, a sharp static shock jolted through my hand. "Damn it," I muttered, shaking my hand. Ethan giggled from the living room. "It doesn't like to be touched, Mommy." I frowned, rubbing my hand. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes never leaving the TV screen. "The balloon. It doesn't like when people touch it." The knot in my stomach tightened. Later that afternoon, we went to the park. The fresh air helped clear my mind, and for a while, I allowed myself to relax. Ethan played on the swings, his laughter filling the air. I watched him carefully, making sure he never left my sight. But as the sun began to set, a strange feeling washed over me. The other children were leaving, their parents calling them home for dinner. Soon, it was just me and Ethan. And the balloon. It hovered above him, as if tethered to something unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. "Ethan, it's time to go," I called. He ran over, his cheeks flushed from playing. "Do we have to?" "Yes, sweetheart. It's getting late." As we walked back to the car, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved between the trees, too fast and too tall to be a person. I stopped, scanning the park, but there was no one there. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Ethan asked. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Let's get home." That night, the tapping started. It was faint at first, like the sound of fingers drumming on glass. I thought it was the tree branches against the window, but when I checked, the tree was still. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. "Ethan?" I called out, stepping into the hallway. His door was open again. The balloon floated near the ceiling, casting a long shadow on the wall. "Ethan, are you awake?" No response. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Ethan was asleep, his little chest rising and falling with each breath. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the room. I turned toward the window and froze. A figure stood outside, silhouetted against the moonlight. It held a red balloon, identical to Ethan's, and its face was obscured by shadow. My breath caught in my throat as the figure raised a hand and tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled backward, grabbing Ethan and pulling him close. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at me with a sleepy smile. "Did you find them, Mommy?" he asked. "Find who?" "The people with balloons," he said, his voice distant. "They've been waiting." The tapping stopped, but the figure remained, its balloon swaying gently in the breeze. And then it smiled. Chapter 3: The Gathering Storm. The next morning, I woke to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, his red balloon floating lazily above him. He was humming a tune I didn't recognize, his small fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden surface. There was a strange calmness to him, as if the events of the previous night hadn't happened. I tried to act normal. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" He nodded without looking up, his eyes fixed on the balloon string. "They're still watching." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's watching?" "The people with balloons." I forced a smile, trying to mask my growing anxiety. "Maybe we should take a break from the balloon today, huh?" Ethan's gaze snapped to me, his expression suddenly serious. "They won't like that." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. I jumped, the sudden noise breaking the tension. I glanced at the clock, 8:03 a.m. Too early for visitors. Stay here, I told Ethan, my voice firmer than I intended. I opened the door to find our neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, standing on the porch. She was holding a plate of cookies, her kind smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Good morning, Claire," she said. "I just wanted to welcome you and Ethan to the neighborhood." "Thank you. That's very sweet of you," I replied, though my voice wavered. Her gaze shifted past me into the house. "Is everything all right? You look a little pale." I hesitated. "It's been a strange few days." Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered. "I'm not surprised. There's been talk about odd things happening around here. Children disappearing, people seeing strange figures." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "The stories go back decades. They say it's a curse tied to the old amusement park on the edge of town. It shut down years ago after a child went missing." I glanced back at Ethan, who was now watching us from the kitchen. The balloon bobbed in the air beside him. "I need to go," I said quickly, taking the plate of cookies. "Thank you for stopping by." Mrs. Thompson gave me a concerned look but nodded. "Just be careful, Claire. And keep an eye on your boy." As I closed the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. That afternoon, I decided to visit the old amusement park. It was a place I'd heard about in passing, a relic of the past left to decay. If there was any truth to Mrs. Thompson's warning, I needed to know. Ethan insisted on coming with me, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him behind. We drove in silence, the red balloon floating in the back seat like a silent passenger. The park was exactly as I'd imagined, overgrown with weeds, the rusted gates creaking in the wind. Faded signs advertised rides that hadn't worked in years. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. As we stepped through the gates, Ethan tugged on my hand. "They're here." "Who's here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The people with balloons." I followed his gaze, and my heart nearly stopped. Figures stood in the shadows, their outlines barely visible. Each one held a red balloon, the strings wrapped tightly around their fingers. "They've been waiting for you," Ethan said, his voice distant. Panic set in. I grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the car. "We're leaving. Now." But the figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The balloons swayed in the breeze, the soft tapping sound growing louder. Tap, tap, tap. Suddenly, Ethan stopped walking. He pulled his hand from mine, turning to face the figures. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "They need me," he said simply. "No," I said, grabbing his shoulders. "We're going home." "They won't let us leave," he whispered. The figures were closer now, their faces still obscured by shadows. One of them raised a hand, pointing at me. "Did you find it?" the figure asked, its voice cold and hollow. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Find what?" "The key," the figure said. "The key to end this." Ethan stepped forward, his balloon floating beside him. "I know where it is." "No!" I cried, pulling him back. "You don't have to do this." But he shook his head. "It's the only way to save us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted key. The figures nodded in unison, their balloons drifting higher into the air. Ethan walked toward the center of the park, where a decrepit carousel stood. He placed the key into a lock on the control panel, turning it slowly. The carousel roared to life, its haunting melody echoing through the park. The figures vanished, their balloons bursting into thin air. Ethan turned to me, his eyes bright again. It's over. But deep down, I knew better. The carousel continued to spin, the melody growing louder. And in the distance, I heard the faint sound of tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Chapter 4. The Haunting Truth. As the carousel spun, the haunting melody seemed to wrap itself around me, pulling me deeper into the eerie atmosphere of the abandoned park. The figures had disappeared, but their presence lingered in the shadows. Ethan stood by the carousel, watching it with a calmness that unnerved me. "Ethan, we need to go," I said, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his eyes distant. "We can't leave yet." My heart pounded in my chest. "Why not? The figures are gone. You did what they wanted." He shook his head slowly. "They're not gone. They're waiting." Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the shadows around us seemed to shift. I glanced at the carousel, and my breath caught in my throat. The horses weren't wooden anymore. They had twisted, grotesque faces, their eyes hollow and dark. The music warped, the once playful tune now a discordant, unsettling melody. "Ethan, please," I begged. "Let's go home." He looked at me, his expression blank. "Home isn't safe anymore." Before I could respond, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the park, coming from all directions. My eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing but shadows and the rustling of dead leaves. Then a voice. "Did you find it?" The same cold, hollow voice from before. It sent chills down my spine. Ethan didn't react. He simply stared at the carousel, his balloon floating beside him. "I don't know what you want," I shouted into the darkness. The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the gloom. It was taller than the others, its face obscured by a tattered hood. In its hand, it held a balloon, but this one was black. The figure stepped closer, its footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. "You must remember," it said, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Remember what?" I whispered, fear tightening my chest. The figure pointed at me, its bony finger trembling. "This isn't the first time." My mind reeled. "What are you talking about?" The figure tilted its head, and the shadows around it seemed to writhe and twist. "You've been here before. You made the deal." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I've never been here before." "I would remember." "Would you?" the figure asked, stepping closer. "Memories fade. Deals remain." The carousel slowed, its haunting melody growing softer. Ethan walked toward me, his expression calm, almost resigned. "Mommy," he said softly, "you have to find the key." "I don't understand," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what they want." Ethan took my hand, his small fingers cold against my skin. "You do. You just don't remember." The figure raised its hand, and the carousel stopped completely. The horses stared at me with hollow eyes, their twisted faces frozen in grotesque expressions. "You locked it away," the figure said. "You hid it to protect yourself. But now it's time to face the truth." The shadows shifted again, revealing a door at the base of the carousel. It was small and unassuming, but something about it filled me with dread. "Go," Ethan said, his voice steady. "It's the only way." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run. But there was no escaping this. I knew that now. With trembling hands, I approached the door. It opened with a soft creak, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced back at Ethan. "Are you coming with me?" He shook his head. "You have to do this alone." My heart ached, but I nodded. "I'll be back for you. I promise." He smiled faintly. "I know." Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the door and began my descent. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness pressed in around me. The tapping continued, guiding me deeper into the shadows. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a small room. In the center was a table, and on it lay an ornate box. It was old, the wood darkened with age, and intricate patterns were carved into its surface. The key. I reached out, my hand trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside was a photograph, a picture of me, holding a balloon. Beside me was a man I didn't recognize, and between us stood Ethan. The shadows around the room seemed to close in, and the tapping stopped. "You made the deal," the figure's voice whispered. "You sealed your fate." Memories flooded my mind, fragmented and distorted. I remembered the amusement park, the balloons, the voices. I remembered making a promise. And I remembered breaking it. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real." The figure appeared beside me, its black balloon swaying gently. "It is." And now, the cycle begins again. The box snapped shut, and the tapping resumed. Tap, tap, tap. Chapter 5. The Endless Cycle. The box in my hands felt heavier with each passing second, as if it carried the weight of every choice I'd ever made. The photograph inside told a story I didn't want to believe, a story I couldn't remember, but deep down, I knew it was true. The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. The figure with the black balloon stood at the edge of the room, watching me with hollow eyes. The shadows around it twisted and writhed, forming shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Ethan's voice echoed in my mind, soft but insistent. "You have to find the key." I gripped the box tightly, my mind racing. The key was in my hands. The truth was in front of me, but I still didn't know what I was supposed to do. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the balloon bobbing gently in the air. "You made the deal. You must finish it." "I don't remember making any deal," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You don't need to remember," the figure replied. "You only need to choose." Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls melted into darkness, and I found myself standing in the amusement park again. The carousel stood in front of me, its twisted horses frozen in grotesque expressions. The figures with balloons surrounded me, their faces hidden in shadow. And in the middle of it all stood Ethan. "Mommy," he said softly, "you have to decide." I took a step toward him. "Decide what?" "The cycle can't be broken," he said, his voice calm. "But it can be changed." The figure with the black balloon stepped forward, its voice echoing through the park. "One must stay. One must go." My heart shattered. "No, I'm not leaving you." Ethan smiled sadly. "It's okay, Mommy. I understand now. I've always known." "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," the figure said. "The hollow needs a keeper. The choice is yours." The shadows pressed in around me, the tapping growing deafening. My mind raced through every possibility, every outcome. But there was only one choice I could make. I knelt down in front of Ethan, cupping his face in my hands. His eyes, once so full of life, now held an understanding far beyond his years. "I love you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I will always love you." "I know," he said, "and I'll always be with you." With trembling hands, I handed him the box. The moment he took it, the figures with balloons vanished, the shadows retreating into the night. The carousel began to spin again, its haunting melody filling the air. Ethan stepped onto the platform, the black balloon floating beside him. As the carousel turned, he looked back at me one last time. "Goodbye, Mommy." Tears streamed down my face as I watched him disappear into the shadows. The tapping stopped. Days turned into weeks, and the world moved on. I tried to return to normal, but nothing felt the same. The house was too quiet, too empty. Every time I passed the park, I felt the weight of the choice I'd made. One night, as I sat in the living room, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I stood and walked to the window. Outside, under the street lamp, a figure stood, holding a red balloon. It was Ethan, but something was different. His eyes were darker, his expression distant. He smiled faintly, lifting the balloon. "Did you find it?" The tapping grew louder, echoing through the night. Tap, tap, tap. The cycle wasn't over. It would never be over. And deep down, I knew. The hollow never truly lets go.